My name is Kenneth Mraz. I'm a strategy specialist with Zang International. We're streaming out there to Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. We're streaming to the multiverse today. So everybody out there watching, appreciate you. So I'm here to fill in today. And yeah, I just want to kind of dive right into something today because, I get this question all the time as a strategy specialist. And people ask me, Kenneth, what actually happens to my real estate, my house, my investment properties, if we see a currency reset or hyperinflation? And, most people think real estate is the ultimate safe haven. But when you actually look at history and what happens to housing during a banking crisis, there's a bit of a pattern that emerges. So what we need to do is just take a look at, how these things play out, because really to know where we are going, we have to be honest about where the real estate market is right now. For the last 30 years, housing prices and interest rates, they operated on a very simple rule of gravity. As interest rates went down, house prices would go up, right? Kind of like a seesaw. Low interest rates on this end, high house prices on this end. Well, we could think of the real estate market like a giant concrete slab that's sitting on top of a hydraulic lift. The hydraulic pressure inside that lift, that's the low interest rates. So for 30 years, the Federal Reserve pumped more and more pressure into that lift, and it was pushing that concrete slab higher and higher. But basic physics tells you that if the hydraulic pressure gets pulled, then that slab has to go down. What we need to do here is take a look at what really happened during 2008. The Federal Reserve started having to pull the hydraulic pressure out of that lift. And as the housing market started going down, they stopped it from finding its true bottom because they went and they just purchased a bunch of mortgage-backed securities. If we actually fast forward into 2022, we see that the Federal Reserve did that same thing because they actually raised interest rates faster than they had in modern history in 2021. But that means by all economic means, the housing prices should have collapsed, but they didn't. Why is that? Well, it's because the Federal Reserve actually purchased more mortgage-backed securities from 2019 to 2021 than they did from 2008 to 2010. And I think we have actually a screen here that will show you that how fast they purchased these. So you can see here, you see that there's that first kind of initial bump in 2008 into 2010, but look at the second gray bar from 2020 into 2021, 2022. So what they did is they basically just created a fragile government scaffolding, okay? Really, they created a fake demand. The housing market, it's no longer supported by reality. So what happens to your home's value when a currency fundamentally breaks down? Well, before we even hit hyperinflation, we usually see a credit freeze. And people love to talk about their home equity. We naturally want to assume that the wood, the concrete, and the land are what hold the value. But guys, in a fiat money system, that's just not the case. Your home's value isn't a reflection of the property. It's a reflection of the cheap credit provided by banks. If you want to see what happens when that credit freezes, look at Japan in the 1990s, right? Back then, the real estate bubble, it was so massive that the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were technically worth more than all the real estate in California combined. And that wasn't real wealth. I call it phantom equity, right? It looked good on paper, but it wasn't doing anything. So when the Bank of Japan was forced to raise rates, the credit cycle broke. And that equity didn't just correct itself, it evaporated. It was a mirage that was trapped inside the drywall. So families and companies both were left holding massive levels of debt on assets that lost 80 to 90% of their value. Because here's the hard truth. When banks stop lending, your buyers disappear. So your house becomes completely illiquid. You can't spend the stucco and you can't eat your equity. So let's talk about the hyperinflation phase then, because this is where a very dangerous illusion takes place. And this is what we need to be looking at, because at Zang International, we're all about looking at currency life cycles. That's what Lynette has spent a lot of her life studying. A currency life cycle works in a pattern, and part of that pattern is hyperinflation. When the general public loses all confidence that is left in the actual currency, the hyperinflation starts taking place because it's the end of that currency's life cycle, and they need to replace that currency. So let's say hyperinflation hits and the price of your house, it might skyrocket. I mean, a home that costs, let's say, $500,000 today might suddenly reprice to $50 million on paper. So people might see that and say, well, hey, I'm rich. I'm a multimillionaire. But this is just a mathematical trick, right? Your house isn't gaining value. It's that the yardstick that you're using to measure your house's value, the dollar, is shrinking. What's the actual purchasing power of that home on the global stage, right? It plummets. And we did just see this play out in Venezuela. Luxury apartments in the Caracas that would sell for about 2 million US were suddenly not even able to fetch 300,000. And we have another slide here actually that'll show. This is from a actual reporting agency for Venezuela. They showed that the loss of the value of the homes in the Caracas in Venezuela when they're going through their hyperinflation. And why does this happen? That's because the mortgage market goes bust. No bank is going to give somebody either a 30-year fixed loan or even an adjustable rate loan when the currency is losing 20, 30% of its value every week. And if you're a landlord, you can forget it. You might lease out a property for $2,700 a month, but by month 3 of hyperinflation, that $2,700 might not even buy you a tank of gas. So you're just operating at massive losses. So here's the thing that most people completely miss when they plan for the future. Banks are the bedrock of world governments. When the banking sector faces a total collapse, the government doesn't just shrug its shoulders and let the banks fail, right? I think we all understand that that's kind of what happened in 2008. The banks got bailed out, so the government steps in, and they can change the rules of the game while you're still playing it. History shows us that this would happen time and time again. In the 1920s in Germany, during their hyperinflation, people paid off their mortgages with worthless paper money. They threw a giant party thinking that they had beat the system. But when the government issued a new currency to fix the economy, they retroactively reinstated parts of those mortgages to save the banks. So let's take a second to kind of really pull back the curtain here. Because to understand how the government can just reinstate a mortgage, you have to understand how a bank actually looks at your mortgage contract. Now, when you and we look at a mortgage, we see our house. You see your kitchen, your backyard. This is your family's shelter. The bank doesn't see that. To a bank, your mortgage is just a line item on a ledger. It's an asset that produces a very specific, predictable stream of cash flow for them over 30 years. And that's it. So again, going back to if we enter into hyperinflation, the currency's collapsing. Suddenly, You could take a couple of pieces of gold or a couple of worthless paychecks and pay off your entire 30-year mortgage in an afternoon. So from your perspective, you've won the game, right? You own your house free and clear. But we have to look at it from the bank's perspective. If their ledger was just wiped out, they also just got paid back in monopoly money. It's money that is basically worthless, right? So if everybody pays off their mortgages with completely worthless currency, the banks lose all of their cash flow producing assets that are sitting on that balance sheet for mortgages. And it's a big part of what could make them become insolvent. So the government cannot let the banking system fail because the banks are the mechanism the government uses to fund itself. So they can declare a bank holiday, they can freeze out the system, and they can invoke emergency powers. And we've seen this playbook before as well. In 1933, they passed the Emergency Banking Act in a matter of hours. During the 2008 crisis, they rewrote the rules to execute massive bailouts. Today, the legal framework to save the banks through bail-ins, it's already sitting right inside the Dodd-Frank Act. When a currency resets, the government has to bring out a new currency. So what about that mortgage you thought you paid off with the old worthless money? So again, to save the banks, the government can just pass an emergency revaluation act or recapitalization act. They can just pass a law that says any debts that were paid off during that hyperinflationary period were paid with a defunct currency. So to stabilize the banking sector, those contracts are hereby re-evaluated. So you wake up on a Monday morning thinking you own your home free and clear, but by a Friday afternoon, the government has passed that emergency legislation stating that you now owe the bank a newly adjusted balance to keep the financial system from collapsing. And they don't have to ask for your permission. They don't have to check your original mortgage contract. They just changed the laws under the umbrella of a national financial emergency. And here's the real kicker. The thing that most commonly would force people out of their homes is actually property taxes. Because real estate is a fixed, hard asset. You can't hide it. You can't move it offshore. And that makes it the easiest target for taxation. So let's really think about it. If the government is going broke and your home's value on paper just became $50 million, what would stop the government from adjusting your taxes based on your new unrealized gains? I mean, historically, people don't really lose their homes in a reset because of the mortgage. They lose their homes because they can no longer afford the skyrocketing property taxes. And once you fall behind on those taxes, the government has the full authority to step in. They can place a tax lien on that house. They can take your property right out from under you. So let's look at this really impartially. Being heavily leveraged in debt during a currency reset, it might actually leave you exposed. When a reset happens, the government can just rewrite the rules, banking contracts can get restructured, and everyday people get trapped inside the liability that the system has built. Do you recall anyone ever going to jail for the 2008 global financial crisis? True safety is found in a sound money strategy that sits completely outside of this brittle, rigged system. And we account for all of these different possible scenarios when we're building this strategy out with you. Property taxes is something that we consider. Your mortgage being paid off is something that we consider. Having a little bit extra put aside just in case they reinstate those mortgages is something we consider. Is it something that you've ever considered, or your regular financial planner? Have they ever considered that for you? Probably not. So if you're kind of starting to realize that your current plan might have some weak spots, just don't wait too long, right? Don't wait for the too big to fail banks to change the terms of your contract. You can take action while you still have options. So there is a link in the description. You can scan that QR code that's on the screen, or you can just give our team a call. We'll sit down with you. We'll do a quick review of your current setup, look at your specific risks, and we'll just show you the exact way to have a strategy to protect your wealth. So you've got a choice. You can get a strategy in place today, or you can roll the dice on this traditional banking system and hope things might be a little bit different this time around. But yeah, appreciate everybody coming in, tuning in. It was a great time, and hopefully a little enlightening. And we'll have Lynette back on here soon. And until next time, stay watchful.